Morning, everybody. Welcome to a very special webinar today. I'm very, very excited about this webinar. As you can see, I'm actually in the middle of my clinic today, but I'll try to jump in as much as I can. We truly have an all-star team for you today, talking about data, which is the foundational layer of artificial intelligence. So we'll talk about some very, very important aspects of data as it relates to artificial intelligence. So really covering a lot of domains. We have Tanush Gupta leading this group from Cerner Intelligence, and he has a vast background on machine learning and artificial intelligence as it relates to areas of data, natural language processing, working on a lot of solutions, which is what we really, really need on the ground. I can tell you for a fact today, I could use some of that AI right now in clinic. And Tanush also has a background as an MBA from Wharton. Next, we have Mark Hoffman, who I know through the years. He's officer from Mercy Children's and professor of pediatrics, with also a very long background on using electronic records for digital phenotyping, and has made a tremendous contribution in that area. And lastly, we have Sarah Gerke, who has the pleasure of meeting also before. She talks on a very vital part of artificial intelligence and data, which is dealing with policy, regulation, and privacy. So, and she's from Harvard Law School. So we have an amazing cast of speakers. Just want to remind everyone before I turn the program to Tanush that we have an exciting upcoming program in April in Abu Dhabi. AIMED will be going to Abu Dhabi and will partnership with AHA. And then we hope to see all of you during the year at our breakfast briefings, as well as other meetings in different parts of the world, as well as across us. And we have our December event, as usual, back in Southern California again. With that, I'm going to turn the program to Tanush.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. Can you guys hear me okay? Show of hands from Sarah and Mark. Can you guys hear me? And then I'll assume everybody's going to see it. I see yes. Great. What I'd like to do is just take about 5 to 10 minutes to level set on some definitions, and then the real stars of the show are going to be Sarah and Mark as we talk through some of the top issues we should be thinking about around data and leveraging big data for AI and machine learning. So a lot of times people have different definitions of AI and machine learning, and I just want to give you a definition to help level set for the rest of the conversation. There is a little bit of echo if somebody's got a mic on. If we can mute that mic. Thank you. So artificial intelligence. This is an oversimplification, but think of it as capabilities that can mimic human behaviors. And there's a lot of technologies that could fall under this umbrella. So we can place robotics under this umbrella. We could place speech recognition under this umbrella, natural language processing, video and vision type of recognition. Machine learning is also part of this that helps extract patterns and understand, make that stuff actionable for AI. So lots of things fall in that bucket. And then we sometimes, at least in healthcare, we carve out machine learning to look at it specifically. And for machine learning, you can think of it as leveraging big data to look for patterns, and patterns that we may not necessarily detect as humans, that help us predict or prescribe certain directions of action. So we've as an industry been looking at intelligence for a long time. And if we use a framework to think about intelligence that I believe Gartner and the advisory board uses, we can think of descriptive intelligence as things that answer the question, what happened in the past? This tends to be business objects, reporting, which we're well familiar with in healthcare. And then you have diagnostic intelligence, which answers the question, why did it happen? Analytics packages, registries, these tend to fit in this bucket, and we're very adept at this in healthcare as well. And then you get into predictive intelligence, and this answers the question, what could happen in the future. We've actually been, as an industry, playing in this space. A simple lab test is a prediction, but on the data side, algorithms, rules-based algorithms can be predictive. If I know a numerator and a denominator, and I have an inclusion and exclusion criteria for both, and it spits out a score, I could potentially predict how close you are to known cases. But what machine learning does is it introduces a new tool for us, which is statistics-based or deep learning-based predictions, which looks retrospectively at the data instead of prospectively to come up with some prediction. And then we've got the fourth category of prescriptive intelligence, which is answering the question, knowing of the future potential, future issue, what can I do about it? So it is essentially clinical decision support, but it's clinical decision support based on a probabilistic scenario instead of an actual scenario. So if I actually have diabetes, I may prescribe a certain care pathway. And if I have the potential to have diabetes or the risk of diabetes 10 months from now, I may prescribe different actions, and we can use machine learning in that bucket. All of this requires big data, which is the topic of today, and looking at big data responsibly. You can think of big data as described as 3 V's, a volume of data across different sources and venues of care, the variety of that data, so the more longitudinal it is and the more venues of care it includes, the better, and then the velocity of access to that data. Big data is not useful unless you can access it fast for quick analysis, and we've seen that in non-healthcare cases. Internet search is a great example. The velocity of us being able to access large volumes of data is transformative for that industry. So the reason we're here today is to really dig into this third bucket. How do we leverage big data responsibly? We, as a healthcare industry, have focused on digitizing paper records, and we have gotten very comfortable with that as an industry over the last 20 years. We have now been hammering away at optimizing workflow, and there's always continuous improvement to do in these spaces, but we've focused largely in these 2 spots. And now we're saying, could we leverage big data in a like we haven't before, and that we see in other industries like retail, consumer tech, entertainment industry. So that's what we want to explore. So I will stop with the definition there so we can get to the meat of the discussion. And Mark, my first question is going to be to you. We tend to, when I say responsible use of big data, we tend to focus on the safety side. But I want to ask you the reverse first. I want to ask whether you can help us think through ways big data could positively impact healthcare. So I'll turn it over to you. Oh, now I think you're muted. There we go.
Got me? Okay.
Yes.
Is that better? Great. So thank you for the invitation to join this. In our work, we look at clinical big data from a variety of perspectives. We work with aggregate de-identified electronic health record data to gain a deeper understanding of real-world clinical practice versus the ideal of how we want to think medicine is being performed in the real world. And through that, we're already seeing some really tangible observations that are very actionable. A few examples. We recently published a paper that showed that using the Cerner HealthFacts data, that youth and young adults who are seen in an emergency room setting for a migraine headache, our question was, how often do they receive an opioid? The general recommendation is that it should almost be 0. We found that 22% of those youth and young adults were receiving an opioid. So that's the real world practice of what's really happening versus what we want to be happening. And that's only possible with very large scale data and analytics capabilities. If you look at genomics, that's another area that's near and dear to us. Working with genomic data is a massive undertaking. At Children's Mercy, our genome lab has sequenced about 12,000 children and their parents in order to reach a diagnosis and hopefully identify unanticipated interventions. So all of that work's only possible with large-scale big data, and often, the toolkit of machine learning, AI, is an important part of really making sense of that complicated data. So I think there's huge opportunities that are already being recognized, but they're just the surface of the potential that I think we have in the long run.
Great. Yeah, these are great clinical examples. Sarah, same question. Positive impact.
Yeah, so I mean, right now there is huge amount of data being collected across the global healthcare system, but not only like in clinical settings, but also through apps and fitness trackers and other wearables. And I mean, data has been like dubbed the new oil because of its value and economic value in today's economy. And so this huge amount of data may lead to positive developments in the field that rely on data, and that's especially in the AI healthcare field. And so I think like AI has really huge potential to transform the healthcare system for the better. And I mean, FDA has already cleared or approved around 30 AI-based products to date. And I think AI especially shows great promise in the areas of imaging and diagnostics. And so just to give you like one example, there's, for example, IDXDR, which is an authorized product by the FDA. It's an AI diagnostic system that provides an autonomous screening decision for the eye disease diabetic retinopathy without any need of the clinician or the physician to also interpret the image or the results. And so it makes it usable by healthcare providers who may usually not be involved in eye care. And I think like in the future, it is expected that in the healthcare context and research, that AI will be increasingly applied in 4 areas from my perspective. So one is like clinical applications, such as imaging and diagnostics and AI-assisted or robotic autonomous surgery someday. It could be in patient consumer use, so health apps, fitness trackers, and chatbots, but also like R&D process, like research and development process, such as the acceleration of the drug discovery process, or also the efficiency of clinical higher efficiency of clinical trials. And then I also think workflow optimization in hospitals, like reduction of costs and the training of clinicians. These are like all areas where we will see that AI enters the clinical or healthcare space. Yeah, so I think with that, I think all that AI is actually only possible through data, and so we need a lot of data to being able to release that potential.
Yeah, great. I mean, I've heard both of you now mention some clinical examples, very strong ones, including practical ones you're already experimenting with, Mark, in your case. And then Sarah, you started addressing there's operational use cases, there's financial use cases, there's pop health stuff related to, I'm calling it pop health, but community-based or encouraging self-care with the devices and things like that. And then you mentioned even drug discovery, so the potential for new innovative discoveries with that data, which is great. Somebody's asked a question, I'm going to ask it now because this is parallel, is what we can do with that data, it's only as good as the quality of that data. Do you guys have any thoughts on how do we ensure better quality data? And let's ask you, Mark, first, then we'll come to you, Sarah.
Yeah, that's a significant area of effort for my team. We, when you look at large-scale aggregate health EHR data, we're finding significant effects that are heterogeneity that's been introduced by the implementation, the variation of implementations of EHR systems has a profound effect on the data. And if you don't understand the front-to-back workflows of how data gets into these sources, you can make pretty critical misinterpretations of the end data. And if you're unleashing deep learning and other things like that, I would expect that many of the findings generated by that will be affected by that heterogeneity. So both data quality as well as, you know, I've seen things that are attributed to missing data, but it's really an artifact of, you know, how the system is implemented. And so if a EHR module was never implemented, you're never going to have that data. But people who don't understand those nuances will just say, well, this is terrible data, it's got missing data. So there's really an important need for collaborative team effort to really make sense of the data. I'm always a little bit skeptical of projects where people just want the data handed to them and they'll figure it out. So that always worries me.
Okay. Any thoughts, Sarah, on this topic?
Yes, so I mean, like I said before, it holds great potential. AI holds great potential to transform the healthcare field, but at the same time, it also raises challenges and also like ethical challenges, because I'm worried about or concerned about bias in data, for example. I think we really need to make sure that these products are safe and effective. And I think one thing we need to make sure is that the data sets and the algorithm are reliable and valid. And one concern, like I mentioned, is like bias. So as this person in the audience asked, it's this question of garbage in, garbage out, and that's really true for health AI. And so the better the training data, for example, is, the better the AI will also perform. And if health AIs are trained on biased data, then existing disparities in health will probably be augmented rather than reduced. And so I also think it is just important that we think about the different types of bias which can exist. And I feel that sometimes in the debate, it's not really clear what we are talking about and what kind of bias. And I think like AI manufacturers should be aware of the types of biases, because it's not only that we can have a bias in the data, in the training data. It could also be that we have a bias, that the algorithm exhibits bias. It can be also that we have, if we train an AI in the US and want to transfer it into another country, there could be an additional risk of a contextual bias. And then there could be even some unconscious bias, because we are bringing in parameters with our own values and beliefs. And then I think that's also important that we have like a diverse team with different expertise to think about those issues, to mitigate these biases, and also as soon as possible in the development process. So for me, I feel like the goal for AI manufacturers should be ethics by design. I call it like that because I feel as soon as you start to develop these products, you should already think not only about the product itself, but also about the ethical consequences, about the legal pathways to go, but thinking about the entire picture and not just first about the product. Because even if you manage to get the data correctly done and the collection and everything, this product actually also needs to be deployed in the healthcare system, and needs to have actually value for physicians or clinicians.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up here, Sarah, and then Mark, curious about your opinions, because we're getting into now some of the risks with leveraging this big data, which is perfect. That's the next place to go. Is it a new problem? And let me frame this better. So if I were published on a clinical study and I'm using data to develop my study results, we as an industry talk about bias in those areas. So are we saying it's similar to that scenario? Are we saying there's new potentials for bias in a machine learning or big data world?
So you mean what is specific or special in the AI context?
Correct. Yeah. So for example, racial bias comes up a lot. We could have racial bias in clinical studies as well, and we've thought of ways to mitigate that. Such as publishing the demographics of the study we've got, peer review publishing, so others can look at it. Are these similar problems just translated to a new medium? Or are we thinking AI machine learning will bring new problems?
I think there are some analogies to the drug development process, but I still think that there are some specific unique problems AI raises. So, for example, let's take this specific concern of black box algorithms. Yeah, I mean there is a huge debate about it. Do we need to be transparent? Do we need to open that black box, or can those products stay a black box? And so you could argue an analogy from the drug development process that, like, for example, take aspirin. I mean, 70 years clinicians prescribed aspirin, and they didn't know the mechanism behind aspirin, but they knew that it works. So you could actually argue perhaps there is no need to open that black box, but what we really need is sufficient clinical trials that give us a proof that those products are safe and effective. But then, even let's say we do that, there is some unique features, I think, when it comes to AI, and that is, if you really want to release the potential, you need to have adaptive algorithms which can learn and adapt to new conditions. And so, let's say you start with a robust product which really is safe and effective in that moment when you get an FDA approval. But then if you would unlock it, like really the potential, and it learns over time, then I think you need to have specific safeguards in place to make sure. You need like a continuously monitoring these devices to make sure that they keep safe and effective. And that's something special and unique to AI, which you don't have with a drug like aspirin.
Yeah, no, that's great. Mark, thoughts on this and bias, or in general, some concerns or risks with big data?
Yeah, I agree with many of Sarah's comments. Bias is definitely a concern that can have a profound effect on using big data. I think things are moving very quickly, and I think we'll probably get into some of the regulatory readiness in a few minutes. But I think, if you keep digging into, for example, race and ethnicity, when you're trying to work with real-world data, there's major coding discrepancies in how each organization will code the patient's race. Often that's done by a registration clerk who's really not thinking about the use of that data for downstream analytics. And we can see the same person who's coded with different races and different encounters. And so those are significant issues when you look at the impact when you start doing analysis on that large scale data. So I agree that that is a concern, and again, there's upstream factors that affect our ability to do strong work with that type of data. I think that the whole black box concern is a very real one. From more of a research perspective, I would frame it also from reproducibility. So the high volume, high velocity data, if you run an algorithm today and you run it again 2 months later, your output is very likely to be at least somewhat different and perhaps substantially different. And so the ability to reproduce based on the impact of new and inbound data is something that really has not yet been adequately, I know it's a topic of concern, but in terms of resolving that concern, there's still a lot of work that's needed in that particular question.
Yep. I'm going to raise another risk we haven't raised yet, and then ask both of your opinion on this. So we see big tech companies coming in, and they're saying, hey, we can do some healthcare type stuff. So the example I'll give you is Facebook was looking at whether they could predict somebody's suicidality based on their newsfeed. And so they created an algorithm to look for this, or to adjust the newsfeed. And they did a sort of test, an A/B test, on a cohort of some people who got one set of newsfeed algorithms and another that got another. And there was some backlash on it. Do you think? I'm trying to. How do I phrase this? Are we gonna? Do we have a future where we need IRB approval for everything we do, or how would we handle that risk differently than, say, the big tech industry? So let's start with you, Mark, and then we'll go to you, Sarah.
I think the IRB question, partly depends on if you're doing the work for true research versus for operations, and that's generally the threshold that we have to apply. I think for sensitive questions like that, there should be some, and then whether there's an intervention. And so I think, in that example, what Facebook would do with that risk analysis is important to understand. I think for a lot of large-scale data analysis, including much of our work, it's mostly a matter of getting your IRB to give you a non-human subjects determination. So often, if you approach things in a way that you truly are working with de-identified data, you can get through that with appropriate level of transparency, but also without necessarily all of the process of doing a full clinical trial. So there will be a lot of variation in how that's handled, but I do think, again, that tech companies in general probably need to be sensitized to how to handle those questions and when do you need to engage an IRB, and then how do you engage an IRB. And they shouldn't see that as something that will delay their work, but rather it strengthens their work. So some of it's also changing your attitude towards how you view that important aspect of compliance.
Very good. Yeah, Sarah, any thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think the problem, I shift the problem a little bit. The problem is here Facebook does not fall on under any healthcare data privacy law right now. So because we have in the US HIPAA, and that's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And HIPAA currently shows its age because it's only applying, or it only covers individual identifiable health information, which is generated by HIPAA-covered entities or their business associates. And so HIPAA-covered entities are most healthcare providers. And so HIPAA, and the problem with HIPAA is that HIPAA does not cover health information that are generated by entities that are not covered by HIPAA. And so much of the health information which is currently collected, such as by Facebook, they fall outside of the HIPAA regime. And so they can actually do whatever they like right now. I'm over exaggerating it, but at the end of the day, with most data, they can do whatever they want right now because they do not need to follow any data privacy laws. And this is one reason why the EU, for example, got the EU General Data Protection Regulation to make sure that every personal data, and including data concerning health, is covered. Right now we see in the US that at the state level that the states also get concerned and start to want to improve the data privacy of individuals. And so we have now since 1st of January the CCPA in California, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, and that really gives or fills partially the gaps which HIPAA has. And so it grants various rights to California residents, California consumers, for personal information that are held by big companies and businesses. And so, the CCPA fills one of these gaps to bring in, to really also make sure that companies like Facebook, etc., need to follow some obligations and legal requirements to protect the data of the individuals. And here we have this problem because right now we have the CCPA, but in the other states there are not those kind of laws. I mean, there are some bills already. Nevada also has right now a data privacy law already, but there are like still gaps, and I think it's also getting quite complicated for companies to apply to all these different regulatory regimes, because even the GDPR, the EU GDPR, has impact on under certain conditions for US companies. And so it's getting quite complicated, and I would actually wish that the US would someday have also like a federal law which supersedes all the state law to make it just easier, so that the companies need to comply to one data privacy law, which and one which really also makes sure that Facebook cannot just do whatever they want with the data and without getting like any consent or anything else, or without having like an IRB approval.
Yeah, good. So we've talked about two major risks, I think. We're saying there's the risk of bias and lots of different biases. And then there's this risk of patient rights and being responsible with any experimentation we do. And so I think it's great. And I'm not trying to pick on big tech. I'm just using it as a contrast, because we've been very careful about, the do no harm aspect of healthcare. You raised, Sarah, regulations in a couple ways. You talked about first the uniqueness of AI algorithms, and that they could be adaptive interventions, which is new. And then you use the word device. I think you referred to it as a device. And then you've raised HIPAA and some of these other regulations. How are you seeing generally machine learning and AI being regulated in the industry, if at all?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So, so some AI products fall under FDA review, and these are products which are devices, yeah? So medical devices, they fall under the medical device framework, and so they need to go through FDA review. But one needs to say that a lot of products are not medical devices and are not classified right now as medical devices. So for example, certain clinical decision support software is not classified as a medical device and is not regulated by the FDA at all. And right now, I think a lot of people heard about this new discussion paper by the FDA for so-called SAMD. So this is software as a medical device. So this is software which is a medical device on its own without being part of a hardware medical device. And so the FDA was thinking how to regulate those devices. And that is great, but you also need to see that this is just like a tiny percentage of all AI-based products right now on the market. So several AI-based products do not fall under that regulatory pathway at all. And so so this is like one thing. Also like lab-based products are also not falling under FDA regulation. But the ones which fall under the medical device, which are classified as medical devices, they need to normally go through FDA clearance or getting an approval by the FDA. And also here, it depends on the risk. But an approval, if you need to go through it, mostly they go through de novo. To the de novo pathway, and if you go through that, you actually have to show a lot of data. But most AI products right now go through 510K, and that actually means you only need to show that there is already a product which is substantially similar to another product which is already on the market. You only need to show that there is already a product which is kind of substantially similar to that one, and then you can go on the market too. So it's actually got also a lot of criticism. But I think one huge problem which every regulator, no matter how you define medical devices, every regulator right now in the world faces the problem of adaptive algorithms. Because right now, so when FDA approves a product, it's a locked algorithm. So that really means an algorithm provides the same result each time the same input is applied to it, and it cannot change with use. And so and as I said before, to make sure that AI actually realizes its potential, it needs to learn all the time and adapt to new conditions. Because let's say you have like a product which was mostly trained in a white population, and then it will be employed in a clinical setting where you have more African American women, for example. Then actually after a while you could update those products to make sure that they are even more accurate for that subpopulations. But the problem right now is, since you have a locked algorithm, if you want to change the algorithm, you need to go through another round of review by the FDA, and that is cost a lot of money, and it is time consuming, and so probably such an update will never occur. And that's a huge problem too, because that means that those products could be better and I actually should get that update, but the update never occurs. And so FDA thought a lot about these issues and came up with this discussion paper thinking about those issues and how we can actually make sure that we can release the potential and can allow manufacturers to update even after the approval. And I wrote recently an article on that problem with some colleagues, and that was published in Science. And we like the idea of FDA and also the thinking of it. But what we emphasized in that article is especially that you need to start to that the focus should not be on ex-ante plans, because FDA so one idea of FDA was to make sure that so that you have to tell in advance. So when you get initial pre-market review, what are actually the updates you want to make. The problem with AI is that often manufacturers do not know what kind of update they need to do. And so it would be better to focus explicitly on post-monitoring monitoring. So like that you have like really continuously monitoring of these products instead of some ex-ante plans, what kind of modification you will do in the future, because you don't know what kind of modifications probably you will need to carry out.
Right, great. Mark, I'm curious about regulatory, and then Anthony. Oh, you've got something, Anthony?
Yeah, I was just going to quickly add that I think FDA really deserves a lot of credit for trying to shift the trajectory of the regulation and keeping with the AI technology, which has a very steep ascent. But I do think that I mentioned last year at the AMN meeting that I think the term software as a device, to me, is sort of a misnomer, because software development is so agile and dynamic, and when people think about a device to be regulated, they have the certain timeline and certain expectation at different stages. I just, I'm not a personal fan of the term software as a device, even though I think people can relate to it, but I'm just afraid that people have a different perception of the timeline and the expectation.
I think with the term, I agree, Anthony. I think with the term of the SAMD, so software as a medical device, I think it's originally not a definition which was adopted by created by the FDA from the IMDRF. This is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, and so this is like a forum where like all regulators around the world come together to try to harmonize medical device regulations. And so I think this is the reason why they use that term, because it was coined by that forum. And it's also now picked up by the EU. So they are also talking now about in the new medical device regulation, which will become applicable, they all start to also talk about SAMDs.
Yeah, good. Mark, rather than just expound here, because these are pretty substantive thoughts here, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball, but it's in the same realm and it's coming from the audience, in the same realm of regulation. So I'm going to read this question, which is that Epic has come out with very public concerns about 21st Century Cure's interop rules. And we have folks, from both all sorts of EHRs on this call, particularly regarding consumer-based apps. So for instance, if someone cites a family history of depression and that their brother Bob tried to commit suicide, now that person's been outed in a potentially unprotected consumer space. So any thoughts on regulation there? One suggestion is HIPAA for consumers by this question, the person who asked this question. But have you thought about that risk, or if you have not, can you think about it with us here?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a very active conversation in social media, in the Twitterverse about this topic. I think in general, there probably is a need for more clarity around how consumer-facing health apps are governed and what the appropriate level of expectations is. Just because the risks are, I think, as with so many things, they should be risk stratified. So the way we handle a particular app should correlate to the risk of harm that could be generated from the misuse of either the app or the data from that app.
Right.
I think so that's a factor. It shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. This is consumer data or not. There should be some risk stratification. I think as with so many other things, the balancing the potential good that can come from those capabilities and the good that can come from a higher level of interoperability than maybe that particular vendor has historically supported versus other vendors. I think those are the conversations that need to be happening, and I think there definitely is a lot of activity right now. But I think in general, more interoperability is still a good thing, but in terms of how we address consumer-facing systems and applications, it's been the Wild West for quite a while now. Fortunately, there haven't been major examples of harm coming, but I think as the use cases get more sophisticated, there's a greater need to be really careful.
Yeah, and you all have kind of alluded to how big tech right now that's not in healthcare has reputational risk, but not necessarily legal risk under HIPAA for misusing data. And now we're seeing these startups or these consumer apps that have no legal risk necessarily, that may not even have that reputational risk since they're small players. So how do we address that? Anthony, question for you, and this also comes from the audience. Since you talked about the FDA, is there, that's federal regulation. Is there a role for state medical boards or state regulation when it comes to the physician's role in managing this data?
Well, it's funny you should mention that question because I am talking to the state medical boards, and I totally agree with Sarah. It's a little bit fragmented when 50 state board representatives are there at the same time almost. And I think we need, hopefully, to have a cohesive plan and strategy for a more federally directed strategy, because I think this landscape is so complicated, and you're compounding that complexity with 50 different bodies regulating, and then the physicians are left truly in the dark. So I do think that certain situations, while we like the individuality of the state medical board, but I do think, at least in the early stages of AI deployment, that we need some cohesion. And I think when I spoke with the state medical board regulators, I think they're in agreement that they need to really not have 50 separate AI regulatory plans for physicians, but hopefully a cohesive plan. And I think then adoption, as well as affecting the regulatory issues of clinicians, will be easier, because it is already challenging, and I think we're just magnifying the complexity by not being cohesive.
Right. Okay. Are there methods? So I'm obviously representing a health IT vendor, and so we're trying to walk the balance of how do we handle data responsibly And so it's why we're having this conversation, to talk about necessary regulations, but then also how do we capitalize on this tool that could have real positive safety impact and other things. So are there ways we could really unlock knowing now the risks we're talking about, knowing some of the benefits, how could our industry really unlock the value of this healthcare data? And Mark, I want to go to you first on that question.
Great. Yeah, I think the industry, Cerner is doing some really impressive things in terms of facilitating data sharing for analytics. As I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of work with the HealthVex data that Cerner makes available to contributors. I think you're doing some really important things, and I know there's work to really scale that up in some really exciting ways. I think I would love to see EHR vendors in particular, in general, when you're doing implementations, approach them from the perspective of the understanding that the data will be used downstream. I think there's a significant disconnect between EHR implementations and analytics. The example I like to give is if a prompt is not always asked, default it to NA and require the users to select a value. Whereas if you leave it blank or if you default it to a 0, that has major impact on the analytics, and the consultants out in the field aren't trained to think about the impact of those decisions that seem pretty minor to them in the moment. But when you're dealing with analyzing that data, those have major impacts. So that's one of my soapbox topics that I'd love to see applied more rigorously at the front end of the process. I think data, and then there's lots of different ways to define and describe data sharing. I did have one thing on the regulatory thing I wanted to add. So in addition to the FDA being challenged to validate decision support that's driven by AI, it's also important to think about the organizations that are implementing that, because most hospitals, for example, have a P&T committee that validates new decision support modules before they're released into practice. And those committees are also only accustomed to dealing with standardized input and output, standardized behavior of those systems. So there's also going to be a major need to educate the people who are doing the systems implementations and validations down at the provider level as we move away from the predictable input and output if-then logic to the much more fluid and variable logic that comes out of AI and machine learning. So I just want to make sure that we're also recognizing impact, not just the regulators, but also of the implementers.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I've never myself thought of that, so that's great. Sarah, any thoughts on unlocking more value? This is great to think of it upstream as much as possible. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, so I just want to say one thing to Mark's comment. So I totally agree. I think it's important to see the entire picture, not only the product, but also the context and where it will be applied, and the hospitals, and that it's that the healthcare professionals are like very important stakeholders that should have a big voice here when it comes to the clinical application of AI and the implementation of AI. Because just to have the product does not mean you have it already employed, and that hospitals will accept that product and that it really has like value in the process and in the healthcare or in a hospital or a clinic. And so, like I said already before, I think like this goal of ethics by design, thinking about like all the different issues from the beginning, I think that's very important. And then when it comes to data sharing, I think it's also important that we share a lot of data because we need a lot of data. But I think we need to do it in an ethical or like also legally, even if there is no law in a specific state, still we should think about the ethics and making sure that on the one hand we have data protection in place for individuals, but on the other hand also facilitating the innovation of AI. And so I feel with data sharing agreements, one should check exactly what is in those agreements, with whom you want to share, and probably also, I think what currently is a huge problem is this problem of re-identification. So even if you have, for example, let's say de-identified data under HIPAA, so even if HIPAA would apply, that if you have another available data set, that it is these days easy to re-identify. And so I feel probably one way one could also address that problem is through the data user agreements, data sharing agreements, that one actually put into those agreements a clause which says that re-identification, the combination with other data sets, is that it's explicitly written down that this is not allowed, something like that, to more getting like an with probably some penalties, I don't know, but probably to just being more aware of those issues.
Yeah, good. I want to, Anthony, come to you with a question. Now, Sarah, early on, and you had stepped out for a minute, but she had mentioned an ophthalmology diagnostic that did autonomous screening, made the decisions without the clinician needing to interpret the results. So this question gets asked a lot is, do we think these AI is going to replace clinicians? Why or why not?
I actually not only think that AI will not displace or replace clinicians, I think it will actually draw more people to be interested in medicine. So we'll see 10 years from now if I'm right or wrong. But I think I was asked a lot whether or not deep learning is going to replace radiologists. And I had a public debate with somebody who's an AI expert that I think there'll be more radiologists, not less radiologists, because I think the radiologist's job description will be rendered more interesting with deployment of AI and use of deep learning. They could be more imaginative with how they look at body structures. I did a project hybridizing an echocardiogram with an MRI, for instance, that was never possible before. So I think the radiologist's job is going to be even more interesting than it is now. And while the machine is doing the perception part of the radiologist's brain, the rest of the brain can easily accommodate that and perhaps be even made more valuable because of that. And I think the number of medical images have escalated, as you know, exponentially. So there's plenty of work for both machine and humans. So I don't think any radiologist should be worrying about their jobs. And I see the fear of that subside quite dramatically in the last 18 months or so.
Good. Mark, same question. What do you think?
I agree with Anthony. I think the prudent approach towards these technologies is to see them as augmenting providers rather than replacing them. As a patient, the least appealing part of being a patient is all of the waiting and all of the time spent between handoffs. And so if your radiologist can process your image faster and triage them and be more able to turn things around faster as a patient, those are things I want. But I still want that human being to have a conversation with. I often say that, you can train, there's examples of training algorithms to detect pneumonia. There's examples of training algorithms to detect breast cancer. Right now, a good radiologist, even if they suspect pneumonia, if you have lung cancer, they'll recognize that. But if the algorithms train really narrowly, we're not to the point yet where there's comprehensive algorithms that take the approach that an expert diagnostician would use of looking at every possible thing that could be reflected in that, whether it's a radiologist or pathologist. So I think we should look at it more as it will shift what you do as a provider, hopefully in good ways, and hopefully in ways that also improve the patient experience.
Yeah, great. The lots of people agreeing with you both on it unlocking or creating excitement in medicine potentially. So it's great. Sarah, I want to give you the final word on this question or anything in this topic before we close.
Yeah, so I agree with Anthony and also Mark. I think we should talk more about like augmented AI, not about the replacement. I feel what would happen is probably that the way how clinicians practice medicine, that's something which will change and not a replacement. And so I feel the only persons who could probably lose their jobs are the ones who are not working someday with AI, probably. Yeah. So I feel like it's all about it's more like right now the AIs should help or support clinicians to do their job better, to improve a patient's care, and I think that's where we should focus on.
Great. Well, thank you. We're a few minutes early, but I think several of us have hard stops, and we have lots of attendees on the call, so I want to make sure we land on time. Always fascinating for me to hear the different topics, learning a lot of new things. I don't know, Anthony, if you have anything to close out this AI Med session, but it's been great.
I want to thank Tanush, Mark, and Sarah. One of the best things about being involved in AI medicine is to just talk with smart people from many, many types of disciplines with diverse backgrounds. And I learn a lot just listening to people. But I do think that one important takeaway also from today is obviously respecting the foundational layer of data and how important that is. But I think it's going to be a difficult journey this decade because as AI methodologies evolve to get more and more sophisticated and we try to catch up, precision medicine sounds fantastic, but it's very, very difficult to execute, as I think all three of you know. And I think we need to be very patient through this decade. But I think the next decade, we're going to realize how amazing the dividend is. So we just need to ride out this difficult journey this decade. And I think we'll probably be underestimating the impact of AI medicine right now, but it's going to deliver really, really big in the following decade.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody, and please fill out the survey that you'll get at the end, and appreciate your time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.